Stop using top-level use server directives. It's way too easy to leak data. That was the headline to this tweet I saw from Reese. And now while it may read like they're pointing out a massive security flaw, it's not directly Next.js's fault, and it appears to be another layer of confusion between the directives of use client and use server. But it's also one that Next.js may be able to take a couple of steps to fix this confusion as well. So let's take a look at what this security flaw is and how you can ensure you don't fall into this, and you may even find some cases in your code where you've done this yourself. We'll also look at what Next.js could do to help out developers to make sure we don't fall into this trap. Before we get started though, consider subscribing to stay up to date in the world of web development. So to start off all of this, I'm going to show you creating a new Next.js application and how we can fall into this trap. So to start off, what we're going to do is we're going to do pm create next app. And then we're just going to create a new one, and let me call that, let's say, use server and then demo. Go through all of this as the defaults. And once all of that is done, we can open this up in VS Code. So with VS Code open, what I've gone ahead and done is open up the browser as well, so we can see our changes here. Now, if I go ahead and run the dev server here, I'll go ahead and reload. What we should see is all of that Next.js boilerplate. I'm going to come into page.tsx here, and I'm going to delete this boilerplate down to here. Let's go ahead now and save that. What we should see is a black page. Now, important to remember here that this home component here is a server component. So how could we add a form to this? Well, the demo I'm going to be showing you is, let's say we implemented a user search functionality. So if you're a logged in user, you should be able to search a list of all of the users that have used the application, for example. So let's go ahead and start our form. Let's do form. We'll give that class name that it's asked for there. I'm going to go ahead and let the AI here fill that in, as that's pretty accurate to what it wanted there. We do /form here as well to make sure that's closed off. What you'll see now is we have a form. It's got that search here, and we can type anything we want into this. Let's say we type in James and submit. And then we have that button of submit for our form here. Now what we want to do is we want to do something with this data. Since we're in a server component here, we can't use any sort of on-click or on-submit or anything like that. So what we have to do in a server component is use an action. So if we use an action here, and then what we can do in here is define our action in line. So what I'm going to do is async function, and then in this function, we're just going to do form data, and that's going to be of type form data as well. Now with this function in here, we need to use our top level or our use server directive, not top level. This one is actually in line with the function. Since we're in a server component, we're allowed to do that. Now what I can do is simply just go ahead and console.log the form data.getSearch, and that's going to log what we put in this input. Now with this search here, what I've done, or what the AI actually did for me, which is really helpful there, is that it says type of window. Now the type of window check here is a really cool check that we can do to just check whether we're running on the client side or the server side. So when this console.logs, it's going to log our search term, and then it's also going to log what the window is. So if I just make sure we know that that is the window there, we'll see, and type of window should be undefined if we're running on the server, and then it will have a value if we're running on the client side. Let's go ahead and type in, let's say, James up here, and press search. What we've seen now is it's done a post request, because when we've created our action in here with that use server directive, this has essentially created an endpoint for us. It's really nice sort of shorthand for the way you would have done it before, which would have been you would have created some API endpoints to do this function for you, and then you would have had the form call off to that API endpoint. But we've done that really quickly with this server action here, creating an endpoint for ourselves. And you'll see that the window here has logged undefined as this ran on the server. Let's go ahead and inspect our element here and go to the console. And what you'll see is every time we hit this search button, nothing is coming out on the client-side console. So we know that this is only running on the server here. Now where things change a little bit is if we have a client component. So let's go ahead and move this off to a client component. So if I do form component.tsx, what I'm going to go ahead and do is copy all of this form that I have here. At the top level of this form component, we're going to use our use client directive here. So now this is a client component. And then we'll simply do a, let's say, export default function form component. And then I'm going to return, and then let's paste in what we had before. Now what we have is we still have this action. Now it's important to note this action isn't going to work anymore with this use server directive, as this is now a client component. So if I actually show you that, if I go ahead and go delete all of this, and then we use form component and we make sure that's imported, go ahead and save that, you'll see it's going to fail to compile, and it's going to say we can't use that inline use server annotated action in client components. So to get around this, what we need to do is create a actions.ts file. And now in this file is when we need to use our top level use server directive. So if I now hit use server up here, you'll see that we have that top level directive there, and I go ahead and save that. And then if I go back to our page or our form component, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out this functionality that we had here, and I'm going to go ahead into my action and let's put this in here. So we're going to do export async function, and then yes, I'm going to call that get user. We can get rid of this use server directive inline here as we're now using it at the top level of the file, and we can go ahead and save all of that. Now in form components, I can go ahead and import all of this. So let's do get user here. And then if I go ahead and save that, we have the functionality we had before. If I clear everything and I type subscribe, something you definitely should do, you'll see we're getting that same functionality before, but this time from a form that's in a client component. So it's logging subscribe and then the window undefined, and it's not logging anything on the client. So this action is definitely running on the server side here. Now where this changes a bit is, let's say we make this a little bit more complex. So let's say, firstly, let's add some user authentication to this. So let's just do const is user authenticated. And I'm going to set this to true here. And then if the user isn't authenticated, what we'll do is we'll throw an error. So instead of this return here, I'm going to throw an error. And then let's just say user is not authenticated. But now I want to filter out, using my search term, all of the users that we have in my application. Maybe I've got like an admin dashboard or something, so when the user's logged in, they can still get all of the users. So let's just create ourselves a really nice helper function here. Let's do export async function, get all users as it's showing us there. And then what we're going to do is in our return, we're going to add a load of users. Now I'm going to let the AI add a couple of users here and see how well this does. Let's just tab through this. I'm using Super Maven, by the way, which I find is a really awesome copilot. But there we go. Let's just add 10 examples there of users. Let's go ahead and save this and make sure we're closing off that component. So now we've got a get all users function. So now in my server action here, let's say once they're authenticated and we've got our search term, and I'm going to make sure this search term is considered a string. What I want to do now is I want to return all of the users that they have. So let's get all of our users first. So const users equals await get all users. So we're using this function down here. And then we can simply return users.filter, where the user.name includes our search term. So there we go. Now we actually need to do something with the return state to show it on the front end here. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to define our type of user, and let's just make sure that equals what we had down here. And then I'm also going to define our form state here. So let's say form state. And for me, that's just going to equal a user array here. Now with this, what we can do is we change our action a little bit to include the previous state, as it can sort of have that. And this is where you can put validation errors and things like that. But for this case, as I said, I'm doing this really simply so I can get it on the front end. Let's go back to our form component now. Now that's been a lot. What we're doing is we're getting an error here as I've changed the way that that action component worked, or that server action worked. What I now need to do to get that state out is use the new hook, use form state. To do that, what I do is const state form action, and this has actually corrected it really nicely for me. So use form state, and we import that from React DOM, and then we add our get user, and then we add our initial state here, which again for me, I'm just going to use an empty array. Now with our action here, we simply change this to form action, and now everything should work nicely. Now what I'm going to go ahead and do is json.stringify what we're going to get back in that state here. So there we go, we've got the users there. Now what you're seeing is users is an empty array. If I hit search at the moment with something empty, obviously it's going to match all of the users we had. So we're getting back all of the users. What you notice here is, again, it's going to log window undefined. Our search term was empty, so it's not logging that, but nothing is logging on the console. If I go ahead and let's say type John in, what you see is it's going to work, and it's only going to pick out the name of John. And again, John, window undefined, nothing coming out to the console here. But we made a fatal mistake here, and we have leaked some data on our server. So what we had here in our action.ts was this use server top level directive. Now what this does is makes any export in this file, if this file is used for any form action, so if any of these get used in a form action or anywhere in our code, this use server now turns all of these into API endpoints. The problem with this is I checked if the user was authenticated here, but I didn't do that check here, as what I've done is I've assumed when I'm running this function later on that I'm always going to check the user authentication first. But the problem is, since I've exported this in an actions.ts file with the top level use server directive, this has now become an endpoint and it's completely unprotected at the moment. So to prove that, let's go over to Postman and see what happens when we send a request for this. So in Postman here, what I've got is I've got the post request that you would send to hit a server action. So what you actually do is you go post request to your URL and then you have next action here. Now next action needs an ID. So how do we get the ID? Well, if we go over and back to our console, what we can do is we can go to the network tab. If I go ahead and refresh this page when all of this JavaScript loads in, what we can see is I then search. And now I currently know the name of these and I'm just going to use it to find these quickly, but you could just pour through someone's code and find these IDs quite quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do get user. Now what you'll see in this code here, now sorry, this is going to be quite small, but let's go ahead and enlarge this. What you'll see is in this get user code or from this file here, let's get rid of this search term here, we can see two IDs here. Now one of them is related to the get all users and one of them is related to get user here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is copy this ID that is related to our get user server action. If I go back to Postman now and I paste that into next action and then I hit send, we should see that we're going to get everything through for a search of an empty string essentially. And if I go back to our Next.js application, what you'll see is every time I hit send on this post request here, we're getting window undefined as if we did an empty search in our search input. But where the problem is, as I said earlier, is if we now go back and we copy this second ID, like so, and then we go back to Postman and we go back to VS Code, what we should see is when I paste this into our next action here and hit send on that, you'll see that we're now getting the list of everything from our data here. We can prove this by coming into get all users here and let's do console.log get all user. Save this. You'll see that we're not getting window undefined as we're not running this anymore. And we're simply getting our get all users and we're getting the list of all of the users here. So I've leaked some data to the front end. Now, as I said before, if we change this ID here back to the other one that it was, which was that 0BF1, and now I say, let's say I make the user unauthenticated here, as you would be if you were just calling the API without logging in, what you'll see is it's going to throw an error, user is not authenticated. But if I now come in here and I change that to the get all user ID, we can get all of those user IDs without user authentication. That is because I have not authenticated the user in this API endpoint. And when I added the export here, it became an API endpoint. So a couple of things we can do to fix this. As I said, this isn't inherently a problem with Next.js. I'll show you later that they're very clear about this in their documentation, but it's a trap that beginners may fall into. As you often do find yourself writing helper functions like this to get all users. And as I said earlier, sort of the logic in some beginners' brains may be, if I use this function anywhere that I've authenticated the user first, I know it's running when the user is authenticated, so I don't need to check it in this function itself. One fix you can do is just make sure you're not exporting that function. So if I don't export that and I hit send, you'll see that there's no server action or API endpoint to call off to. The problem with this is if you have a lot of developers or even yourself working on a project, and let's say you want to use get all users somewhere else, you may quickly add an export to this just thinking, well, I've already written this logic somewhere. Let's just add an export to it and then I can get that from somewhere else later. So it's not the best way to think of that. The best fix really for it is to make sure you're checking your user authentication anywhere you're using a use server directive at the top level, or as some people have pointed out before, just make sure that if you're doing a use server directive that you know that all of these are going to be endpoints, and make sure you're considering that yourself and that any data that you want exposed to your public is going to be user authenticated if it needs to be. Now let's jump over to the PR request that I saw for this, as there's been an interesting discussion from the Next.js team, because as I said, this isn't really their fault. It's just a way of thinking about it that some people may not have read through the documentation thoroughly enough, and they may have fallen into this trap. So what I've actually pulled up here is the issue that Reese opened in the Next.js repo, and he said some similar steps there, and he did some of the reproduction here, which was essentially that everything unused server actions have endpoints created for them. So the export, even if we had that export async function, get all users, and we weren't even using that, what you'd notice is that would also become a API endpoint. So if we scroll down, we see that all of this happens, and then Next.js team replied saying that there essentially isn't much of a problem with this and that it should be protected. There was a bit of back and forth here. And generally, overall, it said, but also keep in mind that server actions are public API endpoints, even though they feel like internal function calls. So you still need an authentication layer for them. I think this is the most important point in all of this sort of debate that we have, is you need to keep this in mind when you're doing anything in your use server directives or using server actions, that they are public API endpoints, even though they feel like internal function calls, as I showed you earlier. Now, down here again, it says server actions are public API endpoints. This needs to be explicitly stated in the documentation. what we can actually see is it actually is. If we go down to security here, what you'll see is you should treat server actions as you would public-facing API endpoints and ensure the user is authorized to perform the action. As I said though, the reason that people fall into this trap is they add that authentication to the one that they're actually using, but then in the same file, they just want to quickly create a helper function, but then they forget to protect that helper function itself, and that's how we sort of fall into this trap. Now, it does actually say this in other places as well. I believe there's a good to know up here with some of this stuff. Yes, so there's a good to know here in the documentation as well that says before mutating data, you should always ensure a user is authorized to perform the action. See authentication and authorization. So again, it takes you down to this bit, which says you should treat them as public-facing API endpoints. But what the PR actually does address, or the issue, is something that needs to be considered. If I go back to our code base here, and let's say I had this get all users call, but I wasn't actually going to use this. If I just make, let's say, users here an empty array for now, and I'm not using get all users, if I still exported this function, an API endpoint would be created for it. Now, what the issue is essentially saying is maybe we should do some sort of better tree shaking here to ensure that if we don't use an exported function in our use server directive, that we aren't creating an API endpoint for it. Because I don't think there's going to be much of a protection to the current way that we do it if we're using the function, as it needs that function to be somewhere to be able to use it in our state up here. The fix for it is essentially in that documentation and making sure all of you guys know about this and make sure you're thinking about this when you're using server actions, which is why I wanted to make this video, to make sure that you're all aware of this and you can keep this in mind when you're going through projects. As there's actually already been, Reese has tweeted out a couple of public facing projects already where he's found sort of the admin prompt for a AI application, and you've been able to look into that because they've used server actions in this way and they maybe haven't thought of this sort of trap that you can fall into. Thank you very much for watching this video on Next.js. Now, if you want to stay updated with web dev news, tips and tricks, do go ahead and subscribe. If you want to watch a video where I explored layouts in Next.js and how there's actually a trap with authentication in them as well, in a similar manner to using Postman here, go ahead and click this video here. And if you want to watch the video that YouTube thinks you should watch, go ahead and click this one here. Thank you for watching.